Brad Farris. Welcome to the ROI Online Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve.
So this is fascinating to me. A billionaire takes you, puts his hand around you and goes, Brad, I trust you to run around the country and I'm just buy some founder-led companies for me. Who in the world gets a deal like that?
Well, it wasn't just me. There was a group of people that we were working together on this, but I do remember vividly the day that I made a presentation to the board and I proposed that they spend $70 million to buy a particular company. And they're like, all right, go do it. And I walked out of there. I'm like, what? There's no way. Why did they take my advice on that? That was the craziest thing ever. I can't believe they did that. And we lost that bid. And I was like, so thankful. But
how old were you at this time?
Oh, I was like 33.
And what in the world where did you get all this authority and game that you could at 33 walk in and pitch something like that to a billionaire and they go do it, Buster?
So one of the things that I learned about family-owned firms is that if the family likes you, right? If you build a little bit of trust with them, they kind of think you can do anything, right? So I'd done nothing like this ever before in my life.
That's funny. They haven't talked to your dad or your mom.
No,
right?
Exactly. Not at all. Or even my spouse or anybody. But I seriously, there was a team that I was working with. My boss at the time was a Harvard MBA. So it wasn't just me, but it still scared the bejesus out of me. I mean, $70 million is a lot of money. And I walked out of there and I think my boss could see the look on my face and he said, Brad, it's just zeros. If it made sense at $70,000, then it makes sense at $70 million. That's how this works. It's just zeros.
Isn't that crazy?
It's super crazy.
My dad, I'd have a problem with just 1 zero. $70, right?
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is that to a billionaire, $70 million is sort of like $70,000 is to me. And so if I was comfortable with it at $70,000, he should be comfortable with it at $70 million.
You'd think, yeah.
And
so go ahead.
We went on to actually win some bids. And, one of them, the owner was like, well, you liked this business, Brad, you run it. And so that was even if I was unqualified to buy businesses, I was totally unqualified to run a business. And I took over a $20 million business in Dallas, and man, I learned a whole lot. Of the 9 top people in the business, 7 of them quit or were fired in the first 3 months.
Yeah.
So it was like, wow, okay, trial by fire.
Yeah. So you do this for a while, and in the back of your mind, you're going, I could kind of do this. I walk in here, I start running this business, I clean it up, I get it going better for someone else. Why can't I do it on my own?
So 2 things happened. One was we didn't buy any businesses within 1,000 miles of Chicago. So I remember waking up one morning in a Courtyard by Marriott, because that's always where I was staying, and turned the TV on, and the Tucson News came on. And as I was getting in the shower, I thought, I know that WGN and Turner are broadcast all over, but I didn't know the Tucson News was broadcast all over. Where am I that they're broadcasting the Tucson News? And then, of course, I was in Tucson. That's why the Tucson. Yeah. But not knowing what town you're in when you wake up, that's not a problem that a lot of people normally have. And
unless you're Mick Jagger.
Yeah, and I'm not Mick Jagger. Right. And so I just decided that I needed to have a more normal life. And so I started thinking, what could I do if I never left Chicago? And sort of flipping sides of the table and working for the business owners instead of for the billionaires.
Right.
Seemed like a way that it might work.
So, Brad, you have a company. We haven't introduced the audience to your company. I was having fun there. So your company is called Anchor Advisors.
That's right.
and you're in Chicago.
It's true.
So tell us a little bit about Anchor Advisors.
So we work with owners of growing creative service firms. So marketing, advertising, PR, web design, those type of folks.
Why? Wait a minute. Why do you work with those people? That you've got a therapy degree, or you've worked with some very, very disturbed, creative, sensitive people, right?
Early on in my solo career, I started working for some creative firms, and what I figured out was a lot of them went to art school, not business school.
Right.
So they're willing to take advice, and they're really smart and creative. So they love solving problems, and they're just kind of, for me, it was fun. These were the people that I wanted to hang out with. These were my tribe. And so that's who I ended up working with.
I see that, because here's the funny thing is, you've got these business owners that run these companies that maybe aren't sexy, maybe they're industrial products or whatever, but there's this point where they realize, I need one of those creative guys. Okay. And then on the other side, the creative guys are going, hey, these business people over here need us, but there's a disconnect in the communication and the expectations and how to take advantage and complement each other.
Well, it is sometimes like they don't speak the same language, like they need a translator, right?
Yeah.
And like you said about expectations, like the client doesn't know what they're buying when they buy creative services.
No.
And to some extent, the creative people don't know what they're selling. So it's like, we're all going to pretend that this is going to be great.
Yeah. No, you said marketing. I know marketing. Okay. But in your head, you see a cabbage head, a head of cabbage. And in my head, I see all this great stuff. And then later, why is he mad at me? I gave him marketing.
You're so right. And I mean, one of the things that I talk with creative people about is the strategy part of the engagement, because the strategy part of the engagement is when you bridge that gap and you start to connect those things up. And if you don't do that part before you let people into the back of the shop to get the goods, then exactly what you said, you're doing what for me? Why? I don't like that blue.
Yeah. Yeah. And you put the wrong YOUR on my social media post. We're going to go out of business now. Yeah. That's why I wrote my book, was to be that subtitle in that foreign language movie.
Yes, exactly.
Our lips are doing this, but what we're saying is different. Right?
Exactly. Right. Right. And just like your book talks about, like, when people come in and they say, I need a website, the first question the creative people should say is why? Why do you need a website? What are you trying to get done? Like, you don't need it. I don't know whether you need a website or not. Maybe you don't.
Yeah. But we're in the beginning, especially us, we're so eager to make people happy and actually get some revenue. That okay, new website on the way, and then later they go, well, this didn't do any good. Go.
Well, what does doing good mean? Yeah.
So you start your own thing, and so you have this interesting thing. It says 0 to 27 streak. Now, I don't think that's zero win. The zero is no wins, right? For 27 at bats.
That is correct.
What went on there? And then is this how you figured out how to help people do better?
So when I first went out on my own, I knew a lot about business, but I had never sold anything before, right?
Yeah.
So I went to a class to teach me how to sell consulting services. And they taught me this whole program, exactly what to say. And I went out, and the first 2 appointments I got, I closed them both.
Wow.
So like, I am obviously a star at
the
sales,
best,
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. No one does this like me.
He's that natural.
Exactly. So I don't need this process. You know what? These guys taught me this thing, but I know how to do this.
Yeah,
so then I went on 27 sales calls in a row that didn't close. And so after the 26th, I called up the guy that was helping me with that I took the course from, and I said, I'm terrible at this. I'm going to starve. My kids
I
are
want
going to
my
live
money
under bread."
back.
Exactly. And he said, "Well, I can't help you, Brad." I'm like, "What do you mean you can't help me?" He says, "You got to go on 3 more sales calls, and after each one, write down what happened, what went well, what did poorly, what do you want to do next time." And so I noticed that I went to the first one, didn't close, but I didn't ask for the order. Like, I had a really great conversation with the person, but I didn't ask him for the business. And I thought, okay, well, next time I'm going to ask him for the business. So I went to the next one. Same thing. Got to the end of the meeting, still hadn't asked him for the business. So the third one, I was like, I don't care what happens. They're going to be dragging me out of here by my heels, and I'm going to shout back, "Would you like to talk about how we can work together to solve these problems?" That one closed. And so ever since then, stick with the program, get the sales. And so it was a terrible 0 for 27 is a lot of no's. It's a lot of no's.
Yeah. Yep. That's been sales is a lot of no's. Well, just life is a bunch of no's, right?
That is true. That is true. But I also, I mean, the really important question or lesson there is to trust the process, right? They gave me this process and it worked. It wasn't me that created those sales. It was the process that created those sales. And every time I start to have a streak of things not going well, it's always go back to the process. What are you not doing that you should be doing?
Yeah. So I would imagine that kind of flows into what you help creative agencies or businesses implement. But before we go there, one of the biggest challenges that any leader, parent, business owner is how to really communicate clearly. And you talk about there was a struggle that you had to get that dialed in. Tell us about that.
So you and I just talked about how when creative services are selling, they're selling apples and someone else is buying bananas and nobody figures that out, right?
Right.
Consulting is kind of the same way. I show up and I say something smart and people are like, "Oh yeah, I want smart things." And so they buy it, and then maybe it's going to solve the problem, maybe it's not, right? And because I was mostly selling face to face, I didn't have to really dial in my marketing message. And so when people would look at my website, they would be like, "Well, what do you do, Brad?" And I'd say, "Well, let's sit down and talk about it. We can find out." And essentially what I was doing was I do whatever you need, right?
Yeah.
If I can discover what you need, I can turn myself into that thing.
Right.
But just a couple of years ago, I started selling to people who didn't live in Chicago. I started selling remotely. And what happens when you start to market on the internet is that you realize that mushy definition of what you do just makes you look like you don't do anything. Like, you start to compare what your website says against what everyone else's website says.
Right.
And you look just like them. And so I had to really sit down and be very clear about, I help these people with this problem, and this is the result you're going to get. And that, oh my gosh, like, having finally done that work, it's amazing. It's fantastic. People actually show up at my door and say, "Hey, I see you do this thing and you solve this problem. Can you do that for me?" And I'm like, "Well, okay, sure. Let's do that."
So did it take you, I hope it took less than 27 attempts at really nailing that message?
It took me many. And I don't, maybe this is, you can be my therapist on this. I don't know that I ever really feel like I've nailed it.
Yeah.
Like, I think I'm always going to be kind of looking at it and feeling like it's not quite there.
Yeah.
But people respond to it, and so that feels better.
No, that is a big challenge. But here's the thing: the trap of getting your messaging clear is to say the obvious thing. So, like we were talking about, someone walks in and goes, "Hey, I think I need a new website." And if we go, "Yes, I can help you with that website," well, that's what we call like the obvious, the logical need. But if we don't really dig in and figure out what's called a higher order goal, there's a reason behind this trigger that makes them actually come in and risk exposing themselves to a marketing agency. They're kind of desperate. They've
Yeah.
run across something that's gone, man, this is not working. We have to do something because things are at risk if we don't. And so to figure out what's really in play and be able to weave that into the message when people go, well, what is it that you do? And so in your case, it's like, Steve, you've worked hard to create this agency and you've been in business for all these years and you've got a lot invested in this. And the reason that you've made it is because you know what you're doing.
That's right.
But inside, you need some help. You're at a point where you can't, what got you here is not going to get you there. And I can help you with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a process.
Yeah.
That's talking to the higher order goal. And
Yeah.
then when they tear up and they start to cry, you nailed it.
I love the way you just said that, because two things that I train everyone on my team about. One is the thing they show up and tell us they need is not really the thing they need.
Mm-mm.
Right?
Mm-mm.
And every client cries. So if you're not ready for them to cry, then it becomes an uncomfortable moment. But I just want to let you know, everybody's going to cry, because what we're talking about is so important to them.
Yes.
That it's really touching something deep inside them. And so they're going to cry. That's what happens when we talk about things that are important to us.
Wow. Yeah. So, like, talk to us a little bit. Now, we have business owners that listen to this, and story brand guides, and marketing directors. So this is a great audience that you can kind of help us. What are like the common themes that you see creative agencies make a mistake? Now, one of the things that you talk about, and this really shocked me when I learned about it, was, and it was from a guy that wrote a book called Buy Then Build. But he said, like, 1 out of 40 businesses will ever reach $1 million in revenue.
That's right.
1 out of 40. Those are incredible odds for someone to go up against.
It's amazing. I actually did this research last year. Of all the businesses in America, 80% of them have 0 employees.
Wow.
So they're solopreneurs. They're working with some 1099s, whatever it is. But 80% have 0 employees. To make it to 10 employees, which is maybe $1.5 million, maybe it's $2 million, something there. Only 4% of businesses make it to that point, to 10 employees. To make it to 20 employees, half of those businesses don't make it. So only 2% of the businesses in America have more than 20 employees. And if you're thinking that your retirement plan is, I'm going to sell this business and that's going to fund my retirement, you probably need to get to that 20 employee level. You need to get to about between 5 and 10 million to get the kind of exit that you're looking for there. And so only 2% of business owners are in a position to do the thing that I think most of us set out to do, which is, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And when I'm ready to leave, I can sell the business and retire on the proceeds. And so it really made me think about, we think about Olympians and everything that they go through to get to that elite point in their sport. Business owners that want to get to that point, you're in the elite 2%. You're in the top of your game. And so just like an Olympian, you've got to be training all the time. You've got to be thinking about, how am I making my business better? How am I making myself better as a leader? How am I treating my body and my mind and the way that I interact with my team, so that we can make it to that elite 2%. You can't get comfortable at any point in that process.
God, it's so true. Everybody all idolizes these sports players and things, but I tell you, I believe that the most competitive thing that you could ever measure yourself against is just yourself trying to run a dadgum business.
running a business, and I'm sure that you could say this too, it has made me change more things about myself. It has made me call into question more parts of myself than being a parent. I mean, having a spouse has changed a lot of things in me and called me, but it's at that level where like things that I thought were fine, I can't put up with if I want to be successful at this. And so it's like the greatest self-improvement program ever made.
Yeah. And you never feel out of the woods.
True. I mean, I will say, I think something changes around $1 million, between 800,000 and 1,500,000, where you're like, okay, I'm not going out of business, right? Like, I'm no longer afraid that I'm not going to have a paycheck. I'm afraid that I'm not going to reach my goals, or that I'm not going to do the best work that I possibly can. And I think that's what drives people beyond that. It drives them. And you need that drive, because the hustle and the energy that you're putting into growing your business to get it to that 800,000.
Yeah.
You're at the limit at that point. Like, you can't just keep hustling and grow it to $10 million.
No.
You need to start building a team and putting systems in place.
And that's a whole nother set of expertise and an investment of study and trial and error.
Well, and it's a whole different way of measuring your self-worth. Because when you're hustling, at the end of every day, you can look at your checklist and say, look, I did these 10 things. I've accomplished something. But when your focus is on building your team, you get to the end of the day and you're like, well, I was in meetings today and I had some conversations with people and I sent some emails, and there's no sense of accomplishment unless you look at it that I am actually creating the system and the environment in which all of this stuff gets done, right? Yeah. So you have to be satisfied with other people's accomplishments as opposed to your own accomplishments.
Yeah. So, there's one book I read was called Predictable Success. And I think the big takeaway from me was to see companies in certain stages of a life cycle, just like you see your kid in a life cycle. Yep. They're a toddler, then they get to the teenager, and then they move out. And it's the same way in a business. And for you to be able to back up and go, all right, where am I? But the requirements of you as an owner change in those cycles as well.
That's exactly right. And it's funny because I love that book. I developed a similar stages of growth, and then I found his book and I was like, wow, okay, so other people are thinking about this too.
Yeah.
But it is true that what a startup business needs is not what a growth business needs. And we kind of intuitively know that. But in terms of what you need to focus on as a business owner, sometimes it's hard to change out of that growth mode, or out of that startup mode into that growth mode.
Yeah. So that's when people say what got you here won't get you there. That's when you have to continually start to add or figure out how to onboard people that can supplement your weak areas.
Well, and there are a whole bunch of startup CEOs who love the chaos and quick decision making and intensity of that startup phase.
Yeah.
And the growth phase, and especially when you get to the stabilization phase, is actually about removing a lot of that chaos. It's about creating more stability and more repeatability.
Right.
And if you feel like being a business owner is about that intensity and that chaos, then you just keep screwing it up. Your team is starting to create systems and you just go break them all the time, because that feels safe to them, but that doesn't feel safe to me. Right.
Yeah. And for me, I had to realize that the way I look at what we're doing and where we're going is very different than the way that your team looks at things.
Yes.
They're looking for predictability. They're looking for ways to be more efficient. And when you come in with this great idea about where we're going next, you're adding more uncertainty, more responsibility. And that's where that power of being able to communicate clearly can calm them down, assuming assuming that you're inserting good change and not just change for change.
I often talk to people that the CEO's job is to break things
Mm-hmm.
because they're visionaries. They see where things need to go, right? And we can't get settled and stuck. We always need to be evolving. And so the CEO's job is to kind of push that evolution. They break things.
Mm-hmm.
And the team's job is to fix the things that the CEO is breaking.
Yeah.
The trick is to figure out not to break things faster than the team can fix them, right? Because that's what leads to chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a delicate balance or a dance that you and your team have to get used to. Is you as the CEO have to slow down the pace of change to give them a chance to do what they're good at, which is build those systems.
So you have these 5 things that you talk about as when you're at the stage where you're getting ready to break through past the $1 million barrier, sound barrier, whatever we want to call it. Talk to us about the 5 things that you talk about.
So the first most important thing is figuring out the product market fit. So if you at the beginning, we're constantly searching, we're trying to find the place where our service meets a need in the marketplace.
Yeah.
And so once we find that, then that's when we know it's time to scale.
Mm-hmm.
So once we've found that fit, and when in finding that, you try lots of things, right? So you experiment, you throw things against the wall. You have money, yeah, we do that, right? And you have to do that to find your product market fit to some extent. You have to try a bunch of things and see what people respond to. But once you find that, you have to stop throwing things against the wall. You have to focus in that one area.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really hard because you've survived by trying new things to this point.
Yes.
But you need to let go of a bunch of those things so that you can focus on that one service for that one client. And I really press people to just pick one target market and offer one service to those people. You can expand later, but to really find that product market fit and to find that repeatability, narrow it way down.
Yeah. So I think the other thing that for me was, you want to please a customer and they have this thing that's just outside of the scope that it's, come on, we could do that, but
how hard could that be?
But it turns out to be the thing that really sours all the good work you did.
That's right.
And what were you doing? You were stupid enough to try to make them happy, but yet it turns out to be the thing that really sours the deal. I think for me, the epiphany was I needed to back up and have more discernment about where the sweet spot of the talent stack of my team was.
Yes.
And only bring in opportunities where we just whistle on the way to work every day because we're in that sweet spot.
You're reducing the risk and making your performance more predictable, right?
Yeah.
And that's what your client wants to buy, is that thing you're really, really good at. And it's like sometimes I talk to people and I say, so what's that one project that you're just like, oh, when I see that, we're going to hit it out of the park. That one's for sure a winner.
Mm-hmm.
Do more of that, right?
Yeah. But it takes a bit of courage to start to decline these other opportunities, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. So that leads us to the second area. And the second area is when you find that thing, that service that you have that matches up with a target market,
mm-hmm.
You have to raise your prices.
Wow. So now I'm selling less, and now I'm going to compound the selling less by increasing my prices. This sounds like the worst advice in the world.
But let's think about what happens when you raise your prices.
Okay.
You find clients that need what you're offering that what you're doing is making a bigger difference for them, right? Because they're willing to give you more money for it.
Mm-hmm.
So you get more engaged clients that want to talk about what a great solution you provided, right? So you're not putting Band-Aids on little cuts.
Yeah.
You've got people that have arteries spurting blood and you're putting a tourniquet on that thing, right?
Right.
And so if you can find those clients, man, it's such a great relationship, right? They're not second guessing you. They're not telling you what to, they're like, do it, do more. And they're telling other people about it. And so raising your prices attracts better clients, and it means that you have more margin. So you don't need, you're not as desperate to pull stuff in. You're paying your people better. You've got an easier problem to solve on the inside too.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you narrow down your market and then raise your prices, like now you're really attracting your raving fans, the people that are going to do the most for you.
Wow. Raving fans instead of raving upset.
You've never had any clients like that, Steve.
No. Well, that's how you figure out when you're throwing things against the wall. It's not that your intent is bad. It's not that you're not wanting to help them. It's that you're figuring out where you're making things worse sometimes instead of better.
That's right.
Getting out of service delivery. Let's talk about that.
Yes. So now that your job as the CEO is no longer to hustle, you can't work harder and keep growing the business anymore, right? So you're building a team, and your team is going to start to do the thing that whatever that thing is that you sell. And so when they start to get good at that, or maybe even a little before that, you need to start pulling yourself out of doing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so if you're a web design company, you got to stop designing the websites. You got to stop running the content audits or doing the workshops with the clients, because the more that you're doing that, the more you're taking opportunities from your team for them to learn to get better at it. And you're not going to innovate the new way to do it. Your team is going to figure out the new, better, more efficient way to do it.
Yeah.
And then further, you've got a different job to do now. You've got to hire good people. You've got to train people. You've got to make sure that your people are working efficiently and effectively.
Yeah.
And so you need to get out of the service delivery so that you can do the CEO job.
I get this classic picture in those movies where you're in the jungle and you're walking along and they get into that quicksand bog, and they're slowly sinking and they're hoping to grasp that one root that they can pull themselves out of that service delivery thing.
Yes.
That's harder than it sounds.
It is. It is harder than it sounds. All of this is hard. No part of this is easy, right? And like, I'm not saying that you wake up one day and you say, I'm never doing another content audit, right? But you're going to say, okay, every time I do a content audit, I'm bringing Steve with me. And Steve and I are going to do it together. And then next month, Steve's going to do it and I'm going to watch. And then next month, Steve's going to do it and report back to me, And so you're slowly, one of the rules that I have for CEOs is that you can't meet with a client by yourself. You always need to bring someone with you. So someone's learning what you're doing and learning the process.
There was this point that I got to, I realized, it's my business, right? But it's like every time I met with a client, I just made things worse for the team. But wait a minute, this is my business. I started this thing. That's why people are coming. But Steve, every time you talk to them, you mess up all our processes.
Exactly. I was working with one CEO. He had a really successful business. His team would beg him not to come to a presentation. And he was like, but I'm great in presentations. This is what I do. And they're like, this is what you used to do. Now we do them a whole different way, and you screw it up when you show up.
Wow. And it's like, it's not because you're crazy. It's not because you're weird. This is common. This is not just your agency only.
That's right.
Or your business.
Yeah. This is a stage that every growing business goes through. Right.
Yeah. So, all right. So new measures for success. Now, is this on me as the agency owner?
Yes. Yeah, it's what we talked about a little bit earlier. Like, so if your identity, if what you felt like you were good at was showing up and doing that presentation and closing the deal,
Yeah.
that's my measure of success. That's how I know that I'm doing a good job. And now my
Right.
team is telling me not to show up to those deals.
Oops.
Yeah. So what do I do? What am I good for? And so this is rethinking your role and thinking about, what am I good for? If I'm not going to do the thing, my role is actually to build the system, right? To build the process, to hire the right people, to train them. And so your role changes, and so how you measure success has to change.
There's this book by Simon Sinek. It's called Leaders Eat Last.
Yes.
Okay, and so that in that book, I realized, or I think my big takeaway from that book was, it is my job to create an environment of safety inside and to provide the tools to help people be successful. That's where
right.
my role had transitioned.
That's right. And you know, that was really insightful. And like that first part, creating the environment of safety, is so important, but it's also really tricky to measure, right? Like at the end of the month, when you're looking back and trying to say, what did I do that was great this month?
Yeah.
How do you say, well, I did a great job creating an environment of safety, right?
Right. But and that is, so culture is a word that comes up in that environment thing. It's like, okay, so if I'm going to hire someone, they need to know that we don't have to watch our back within this organization. Okay. The dangers are outside of this organization.
Right.
We're here to work together to overcome these dangers.
Yes. Yeah, man, that is super, like, I never put it that way before, but what you're saying is so right. When we're small and the business is us,
yeah,
the risk is that our team is going to screw up and make us look bad. Right?
Yeah.
Our ego, so our fear is that the people that are going to hurt us are inside the business.
Right.
But the truth is, the people that are going to hurt us are outside the business.
Yeah.
Right? It's the competition, it's the marketplace, it's the coronavirus, it's whatever it is, right?
Exactly.
And so that's another thing that shifts, and it is that we start to spend less time focused on the inner workings of the business. We have a team that's doing some of that. We still have to do the environment and the culture and those kind of things. But it gives us room to start looking outside the business at, where's this industry going and what new technology is showing up, and you know, what's happening from a regulation or government perspective. And that is really important CEO work. Like, you're the only one that's going to do that outside the business work. And so that's really critical.
You know, the other danger that I found is, like, I see that your business, like when you started, so you got this handful of people on the bus, so to speak, or the train, but at every stop that the train gets to, the door opens. Some people get on, some people get off, you know, but some people stay on to the next stops, the next stop.
Right.
And there's this juggle of insecurity. Then you can get into a feeling of confidence because you're developing the systems. We call it like the ROI way or whatever. We're putting the ROI-ness on stuff. And that's what starts to give us confidence to onboard and exit team members when life just has it happen.
That's right. Yeah, I feel like a lot of business owners take it personally when someone quits.
Yeah. Yeah. At first it does, yeah.
Right. But it just happens. People quit. It's okay. In fact, like, if your whole team has been there 20 years, you know, there might be a lack of change and innovation going on in your organization, and bringing someone new in really gives you an opportunity to look at things with a fresh perspective, and maybe you're going to find some improvements there.
So number 5 is focus on different things.
Yeah, focusing on different things.
Yeah,
which is what we were just talking about. That now that you're freed up from watching the details of every project, you're measuring yourself differently. So you need to start shifting your time to more strategic things. Instead of looking at things that are going to come to fruition in the next month or quarter, you need to be looking at things that are going to come to fruition a year from now or 2 years from now. And so that means like picking your head up literally and looking further out at the horizon, looking at the threats that are outside the business, that what's coming towards us. How do we need, what new talent are we going to need to meet the challenges that are coming in down the road? What new skills are we going to need? What are the things that we're doing now that we need to stop doing because the environment that we're working in is changing? Our customers are changing. And so your job, the CEO's job, not the production manager's job, right? The CEO's job is to have a point of view about what's coming and start to arrange the resources, financial, human capital, knowledge that we're going to need to meet those challenges.
Yeah. So you have this mastermind group process now.
Yeah.
It's called growth phase. Is that right?
The mastermind is the Own Your Course mastermind group. So one of our core ideas is that we become business owners because we want to own our course. No one else is going to tell us, right?
No.
But
by golly.
Whether that's good for us or not. And so we're helping you to own your course. And so I've done 18 years of consulting one-on-one with clients. And what I found was there was only so far that I could take them one-on-one. I could teach them things, but there were certain things that they had to catch from other people that were also doing it.
Yeah.
And so we put these mastermind groups together with 5 business owners. And in the mastermind, there's teaching and training and coaching, but more importantly, there's another business owner there that can say, hey, here's how I did that and here's how it worked out for me. Or, I was thinking just like you and now I think differently. And it's just amazing how much they're just messages that people hear better from their peers than they do from an expert that they're paying.
I tell you, I talk about it in my book, but I got the privilege of getting a scholarship to go to the Goldman Sachs Small Business 2000.
Yeah.
Right. And I talk about, I'm sitting in that class and here's all these people, all these different businesses. There's 40 of us in there and there are all different stages of the life cycle of their business. But I realized that these things that I could never discuss with anyone else, not because no one cared, but the people that I see every day and your spouse, they don't relate because they're not experiencing the same things you are.
Right.
And
That's
sitting in that class, I realized I wasn't crazy. And, right? Because you do.
At least not in this way.
Right. You do doubt yourself why you chose to do this because you're challenged beyond your capabilities and you know it.
Yeah.
But you show up every day anyway.
That's right.
So that was so cool. So is this mastermind class? Is this where people cry?
I'm trying to think if I think we've had a couple people cry in the mastermind. Usually people cry in the one-to-one. So the mastermind, we're meeting 90 minutes twice a month, talking about our challenges. We've got accountability. There's still a one-to-one coaching meeting in between those meetings. And so usually it's in the one-to-one where people get down and a little more honest about what's going on.
So you're from Chicago.
Indeed.
And so is it just in the nature of the Chicagoan to make people cry in these one-on-ones or?
I don't know. I'm not trying to make anybody cry, Steve.
I know.
But I think that there is something about showing up in a way where it's going to be okay if that happens.
Right.
That lets people get to deeper issues. There's a business culture where we're all like, yeah, everything's cool. Oh, we're killing it.
Right.
I'm not in that world. And so giving people space to, like you said, to figure out that they're not crazy and that, that they are going to have to change and the change is hard.
So I always wonder, what's the one question that no one ever asked you that you wish they would, because it's something you want to talk about?
Um, so we talked a little bit about how like business ownership is a self-improvement program.
Hmm.
Like it forces you to look at things in your life and to change things in your life. And I don't think any of us set out owning a business in order to have it grind off every rough edge that we have.
Right.
But once I got into it, I started saying, this is a good thing. I want to embrace the fact that I need to face these things and fix these things because I want to be good at what I do. And, but transformation is hard. Making personal change is really hard.
Hmm.
And that's where I think having some sort of peer group can be super effective. And the downstream effect of that is so critical. If I'm doing my work so I can show up and be a better leader in the office, it also means I'm showing up to be a better leader at home. I'm engaging in my community with a more whole self.
Yeah.
I'm creating an environment where my team can show up and have that same experience where they're showing up with their whole selves and to feel like they're making progress in their lives. So they go home and feel better about themselves when they're with their families. And so this one act of opening yourself up for transformation kind of opens this Pandora's box that I think just spills out all over the place. And that's what's drawn me and made me connected to it. Because I just see how that business owner is a linchpin in so many lives.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because society has this. We're programmed to think that business is bad,
Yes.
greedy, selfish. And yet that 98% of the businesses out there, they're just mom and dads. They're just goofballs like me
Yep.
trying to do something and actually providing opportunities for your employees and their families and creating products and services that actually change and improve our lives.
That's right. That's right.
So I love
And
that.
if I think that when we don't open ourselves up to the transformation that we're invited into as business owners, I think that's
Mhm.
when you start to see the negative aspects of business. Those business owners that are shouting at everybody or triggered by everything or, trying to get a better deal for themselves and ignoring the effects on everybody else. That's the fruit of not making the changes that you need to make in yourself to be a better leader. And like so many things, we get painted with a broad brush.
So I didn't know you worked for the same guy I did.
Yeah, me. I say that everybody that works for themselves has a nut job for a boss. Well, why did he promise that deliverable? We can't deliver it on that time.
Right.
He's crazy.
So what's like the one piece of advice that you love, that you've seen really make a big difference on this transformation conversation? What's that one thing that you love to share with people?
I'm kind of known for telling everybody to raise their prices. Like raise
Yeah.
your prices is a thing that I think I've told every client, and we've done it for every client we've ever worked with. And
Mhm.
it's so transformational to charge what you're worth and to be okay with some no's. It's okay if some people say no. But when the people say yes, and it's twice as much as you charged before or 3 times as much as you charged before, man, that feels amazing, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you start looking back at those other clients who you were perfectly happy to work with before.
Hmm.
Now you're looking back at them like, oh, they're ripping me off. Like, I can't believe that they're.
Well, but that's your tuition, right?
True.
If you
Right.
went to school, you would have financed that and still be paying it. And literally, that was your tuition to get to the insights that you have now.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. But having the courage to raise your prices when you go to do it, it's not like you have to put a sign on your front of your building that, hey, I doubled my price. You can just talk to that one next prospect and ask them for twice as much money as you asked before.
Uh-huh.
And if they say yes, man, do it again. Double
Right.
it again for the next guy. Like you don't know how high people will be willing to pay if you find the people that really need what you have to sell.
So to the agency owners, the creative people that are listening, how does like startup conversation with you go? Help us envision what that would look like.
People generally call me in one of two situations. They're exhausted because they've been hustling and they just don't. People call me and say, I just don't know if I can keep doing this.
Wow.
They're thinking about quitting because they've just been working so hard, and it doesn't have to be that hard. You don't. There's another way to do it. The other people that call me call because they're riding a rocket ship. Like things are going great, but they're looking out there into the future, and they're like, I don't know if this is sustainable. I don't know what I'm doing. This is the biggest business I've ever been. And so in either case, we sit down and actually first I usually send them through an assessment. We talked about those stages of business growth.
Mm-hmm.
I've got an assessment on my website at anchoradvisors.com/growth-phase that helps people to see where they are in those stages of growth and points out to them kind of the one next thing that they need to be focused on, so that they don't have to focus on a million things. You can just let's just do this one thing. And for some people that's enough. Like focusing down helps them to do that, and then they do the next thing, and then they do the next thing, and that's great. For other people, they're still like the exhaustion is too high or the growth still feels out of control. And so we'll have a call where we talk about what the next things are for them. And, it might be one of the mastermind groups. It might be some one-on-one work and then work in a mastermind group. So there's a lot of different ways it can go at that point. But what I would encourage you to do is if you're feeling that desperation, don't go it alone. Go find somebody, whether it's me or somebody else, to talk to about it, because you're consuming a non-renewable resource. Your passion and energy for what you do will run out if you don't renew it. And so if your gas gauge is on E, you got to give somebody a call, and maybe stopping by and doing that assessment might be the next thing.
One of the indicators the gas gauge may be on E is if you're crying in the shower, right?
You might be below E if you're crying in the shower on a regular basis. But yes, or just exhausted. I think that for a lot of people, if you haven't been on vacation in 2 years, like that's not a sustainable situation.
Right.
If the important relationships in your life, if they're saying, hey, are we going to get to see you this month? That would be an indication that you're on E.
Wow. It's hard sometimes to determine whether you're just in a phase and you're going to turn out of this. You just need to last a little longer, right? So, but the thing is, you're not the only one this is normal. Whatever you're experiencing, you're not the first one to go through this.
It was my wife who said, yeah, Brad, the last 3 times we've had this conversation, you told me that this was just going to last 2 more weeks and then everything would be better. Like you just needed to get through this one hump or this one push or this one project. And that was when I had to say, it's always, the solution is always just over the hill. And that doesn't seem right.
So the mastermind seems like it would be a nice, safe way to discern whether, because this coach role that you have, it's to pick the wrong coach adds a whole nother level of risk in you staying in business. And so that mastermind group seems to me it might be a great way to evaluate whether a deeper conversation or a deeper coaching role would be a good decision or not.
And if somebody's taken the assessment, they might have some questions about what that means for them. I'm happy to get on the phone and talk that through with them. And that's another way to evaluate, like, what was that like? What was that experience like talking about that? Is it giving me more peace, or is it stirring me up more? Right.
Yeah, serious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. Brad, man, you're an awesome guest. This has been fun.
Oh, I really love this podcast, Steve. I told you before we got on the air that I started listening so that I could be a better guest, and I just kept going back through more and more episodes. So I'm really enjoying it. You're great at bringing stuff out of people, so I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate that. So if you guys want to reach out to Brad, sounds like it might be worth a conversation. And Brad, you're on LinkedIn.
I am.
Go ahead and tell us again where to hook up with you.
Sure. So on LinkedIn, it's just search for Brad Farris with an A, Farris. And then if you go to anchoradvisors.com, the growth assessment is there on the homepage. But if you want to hop right to it, anchoradvisors.com/growth-phase.
All right. Well, Brad, thanks for being a great guest
Thank you, Steve.
on the ROI Online Podcast. And that's a wrap.